Welcome to session 7 of the Gospel of the Kingdom of God. Tonight's session is titled Judging and Warnings. So what we're going to be dealing with is we're going to finish up the Sermon on the Mount rulings section. That's the judging. And then we'll move to the last section of the Sermon on the Mount, which is the warnings section. But first, let's do our recap. Our recap keeps growing. Session 1, the gospel is the kingdom. That's the rule and reign of God, which exists both now among God's people and in the future, filling the earth. Session 2, Adam and Eve and everybody else has violated the commandment to not reject God's authority for their own. And that's what's meant by the knowledge of good and evil. And that brought about death. The good news is that God has made a way to get out of that problem and to get out of the problem of death. And that's by returning to his authority. We saw in session 3 that how that happens is through covenants. And specifically, the new covenant is the final covenant God is offering to mankind to return to him. And we saw that the man, Jesus of Nazareth, is the promised messianic king who inherited and oversees the new covenant. In session 4, we saw the Sermon on the Mount is a good place to go and find the terms of the new covenant, and that it follows the pattern of the old covenant with its 3 sections. Session 5, we saw that the covenant is an implementation of God's laws, not the law itself. We saw kingdom people are consistently characterized on both the inside and the outside by the Beatitudes, that list at the beginning of Matthew 5. And kingdom people will go to great lengths to live out God's commands, sacrificing in order to love and serve others. And then finally, in session 6, last time we saw that you can seek reward. That's okay for spiritual or religious work, but you're either going to do that from people or from God. You can't do it from both. So if you're trying to seek your reward from people, you're not going to receive a reward from God. And we saw that if we worry about where our provisions, our livelihood, our sufficiency is going to come from, then we're going to live according to that worry. And so we demonstrate by that we don't really trust God. We don't really believe or trust him. So we don't want to live a life of worry. And finally, kingdom people show their loyalty to God through self-sacrifice, removing sin and oppression, and being generous to help all those in need. Okay, so in this session, part 1 is going to be on how to judge and the summary of the ruling. So that will wrap up the rulings section of the Sermon on the Mount. And then we're going to have 2 parts on the warnings, and we'll focus in part 2 mostly in the Sermon on the Mount, and in part 3 we're going to look at some other areas where Jesus is warning us about not being faithful to the covenant. Okay, let's get started with the part 1, how to judge, and the summary of the ruling. So first of all, the next section is the beginning of Matthew 7, and I want to show you something that you may not have heard before. That this section, if you've read this before, it starts off about judging, but what you may not know is that all the way through verse 11 is about judging. So let's read this together. Do not judge so that you will not be judged. For in the way you judge, you will be judged, and by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, and look, the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. Do not give what is holy to dogs, and do not throw your pearls before pigs, or they will trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and it will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks it will be opened. Or what person is there among you, when his son asks for a loaf of bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, he will not give him a snake, will he? So if you, despite being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who ask him? Now, you may have thought or read in the past that these as three different things, and it may be divided in your Bible as 2 or 3 different things. But this is all one section. It's all on the topic of judging. So I'm going to break this down, first of all, and then we'll get into the individual sections. So the first part, verses 1 through 5, this is basically saying, don't use your own judgment. Your own judgment is probably bad. Don't use it. The second section, which is verse 6, this is the pearls before swine, is basically saying, it's an idiom that's basically saying, you'd better use good judgment. You better, because you get yourself in trouble if you don't. And then finally, it is Jesus's answer. Okay, well, if you're not supposed to use your own judgment, but you better use good judgment, then how do you do that? It's seeking God for good judgment, and he'll give it to you. And then this section is dealing predominantly with judgment that involves other people, dealing with other people. It's not necessarily every aspect of judgment, right? There's a lot of judging that you have to do on a daily basis that really it's not a big deal, and it's not a matter of relationships with other people and how to interact with other people, how to deal with difficult situations and those kinds of things. So that's what this teaching by Jesus is dealing with, a more important kind of judging where you're dealing with issues with other people. And judging includes 3 different things that are important that we'll see throughout this section. The first is we have to have knowledge. We have to know about what's going on. We have to have, accurate information about the situation. The second is we have to have the right attitude. And we need to have God's attitude towards whatever is going on, and not have some, wrong attitude towards the person in the situation. And then finally, we need wisdom. Wisdom is to know what to do. What action should I take or should I not take? That sort of thing. And so we need all 3 of these to have proper judgment. Well, all 3 of them really need to come with God's help. So we might have partial knowledge. We might ask some questions and we get some knowledge, but we may not even be getting the right answers. Maybe the other people don't really know what's going on with them, that sort of thing. So we need to have accurate knowledge, and the best accurate knowledge comes from God. And then, attitude. We need to have the same attitude as God towards other people and dealing with situations in which you need to use good judgment. And then wisdom. It's really hard to know what the right course of action is. And even if you have consistently seen that a particular course of action works with people under certain circumstances, it doesn't mean that the next time that happens, that is going to be the right course of action. So we really need God's help in knowing what to do. All right, so let's look at this first piece, and we'll dig down into this a little bit. Do not judge so that you will not be judged. For in the way you judged, you will be judged, and by your standard of measure, it will be measured back to you. So God is going to judge you. Not only God, but other people will judge you by the way that you judge other people. And so we want to be careful about how we judge and not necessarily use our own standards of measure for that. In verse 3, why do you look at the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Well, this obviously is a big problem. If you are, judging somebody else, but in reality, you're dealing with even bigger problems in your own life, it's not a good idea to judge somebody else. And more importantly, in verse 4, he kind of repeats that same thing. How can you say, let me take that speck out of your eye, and you got a log in your own eye? You just look ridiculous in those situations. But more importantly, verse 5, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. So you have to really, in order to really have good judgment regarding other people, you need to be in a pretty good place. If your judgment in yourself is bad, your judgment with other people is definitely going to be bad. So this is basically saying, be careful about using your own judgment. If your own judgment can be so bad, and it's so easy for that to be the case, even if you've had good judgment before, it doesn't mean that you're going to have all the information to have accurate judgment in a particular situation, or even know the right thing to do in that particular situation. So it's best just to kind of step back from your own judgment and seek God for that. In the second part, you had better use good judgment. Do not give what is holy to dogs, and do not throw your pearls before pigs, or they will trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. So basically, this is a colorful way of saying you better use good judgment. If you get into a situation with someone and you're trying to correct some behavior, for instance, and they turn on you and make your life miserable, well, you probably weren't using the right judgment in that situation. And at least there's a good chance of that, especially if you hadn't sought God about that. So again, first part, don't use your own judgment. Your own judgment's probably not going to be good, but you do need to use judgment. So the answer, this is the good part. Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. And who are we asking? We're asking the Lord. We're asking God. You want to seek wisdom from Jesus, and he gets his wisdom from God. We want wisdom from God. I want to go to my Father, and I want to ask him for wisdom. And then verse 8, and it will be open to you, right? So just ask, and they're going to open that door. Verse 8, for everyone who asks receives, and one who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks it will be opened. If we're genuinely trying to seek God for knowledge and the right attitude, wisdom, how to really judge a situation correctly, he's going to answer us. And then Matthew is going to then turn and say, what he just said about asking and receiving from God for wisdom is so obvious of a father to do. I mean, look at yourselves, right? Would you, if you have a son and your son asks for bread, do you give him a stone? No, of course not. You obviously would give them bread. And verse 10, if your son asks for a fish, are you going to give him a snake? No. Are you going to give, in the first case, he's asking for nourishment, and you're giving something that's useless to him, right? So God is not going to give us something that's useless. Verse 10, if he asks for a fish, he will not give him a snake, will he? In this case, he's asking again for nutrition. He's hungry, and you're not going to give him a snake, something that would hurt him, right? Obviously, God isn't going to give us judgment that is intended to hurt us. So if you, verse 11, so if you, despite being evil, and the word evil here, you have to understand it in terms of it's, you compared to God, right? It's our comparison. It's not that he's not saying you're necessarily evil. He's saying that by comparison to God, you are evil. And so if you, by comparison, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who ask him? And again, we're talking about judgment. And so Matthew is basically saying, of course, God is going to answer you when you ask for judgment, when you sincerely go to him and ask God, I don't know what to do. I want to have the right attitude. I need to know what I need to know to about this situation, Father, I need your help, there's no way he's going to not. He's your father. He would be a terrible father if he didn't help you with that. And so we should expect to receive wisdom from God when we sincerely go and ask him. Okay, so that wraps up the section on judging, and I'm not going to. We need to move on to the summary piece, but I really think it's that last section is really powerful in terms of how we go about living out the Beatitudes, living out the commandments, right? That it's hard for us to know how to be a peacemaker in a particular situation. It's hard to know, when I'm interacting with someone, is this how to have mercy on that situation and with regard to that person, those sorts of things. If someone is persecuting me and I am thinking along the lines of I want to do good for that person, how do I do that effectively, right? How do I judge in that situation? So this last piece is really, really important for how we then successfully walk. And so we need to seek God for that. All right, so let's move on to the summary of the ruling. So this is the last verse in the ruling section, which began in the middle part of chapter 5. This is Matthew 7:12, where Jesus says, "In everything, therefore, treat people the same way you want them to treat you, for this is the law and the prophets." So he's basically wrapping up the entire ruling section in this one statement. In other words, giving a practical way to think about how to carry out the commands in a way that's helpful, that if I'm just thinking about how I want to be treated, and I treat somebody else along those same lines, then it should help me. So that basically boils down to moving from self-centeredness into other-centeredness. In other words, it's not just taking the focus off of myself and putting it on others. It's actually caring for others in the way that I care for myself and how I want others to treat me. Paul, in his writings, would say in Ephesians, no one hates his own flesh, right? So I don't hate myself. I don't hate my body. I want to care for my body, right? I want to care for myself. If I'm suffering, I want to alleviate the suffering, right? And so, it's not just simply that I need, when I say self-centeredness, becoming other-centeredness, it's not just a shift of focus. Well, I'm going to focus on other people. No, it's I have to re-engineer my thinking so that I think about how I care about myself, and I transfer that exact same kind of care to other people. And then the second thing is in that last part, for this is the law and the prophets. So what we're talking about is self-sacrificial love, and this is how it fulfills the law and the prophets. So the law and the prophets is basically a summary phrase of the entirety of the Old Testament. So it's just kind of everything, right? So all that the books of the Old Testament, everything that God said in the Old Testament, everything that he wants, that he outlines either through a commandment or a ruling or various prophetic books, that even Psalms and all that kind of stuff. All of those things are basically boiled down to self-sacrificial love. All right, so I've got a couple other notes here. I didn't realize. There we go. Oops. So the law, that you want to think about that in terms of the commandments and the rulings, like That's the what we're thinking about in terms of, if you're talking about the Old Testament, the law, you would really think about the books of Moses. And so you've got, that's where you find the commandments and the rulings. And then the prophets is calling people back to the covenant. So the purpose of the books of the prophets was people had wandered away from the covenant. And so it like really wandered away from the covenant. And so the prophets continually, both the prophets that were where their prophesying wasn't written down in a book. So this would be like Elijah, for example, their main function was to call people back to the covenant. And then the later prophets, what they were doing was they were telling the people that you have violated the covenant. God is bringing about the curses of the covenant, but there is hope. He's going to make a new covenant. So again, they're calling people to the covenant in a little different way. All right, let's review part one. So we need to use good judgment in dealing with people, but God's help is the only way to accomplish that in the best way, in the way that it's going to, if God is giving you judgment on something, then no matter how it turns out, that was the best way. Then we saw judging involves three things: knowledge of the situation, our attitude, having the correct perspective of the situation, and applying the best course of action. That's wisdom, right? So we need to have wisdom. We need to know what the right thing to do in that situation is. And then finally, Jesus sums up the rulings, that is the idea of fulfilling the commandments. How are we supposed to fulfill the commandments? Through the simple principle of treating others with the same care with which we treat ourselves, and how we want then others to treat us. So I transfer my care to that same care that I have for myself to other people, and I will fulfill the commandments. All right, and we'll stop there and we'll pick it up in part 2.